And now, to introduce our first keynote speaker of Psychedelics 2026, Day 3, Paul S. Regier, a PhD, is a research assistant professor of psychiatry in the Center for Studies of Addiction. He received his bachelor's in psychology at the University of Nebraska at Omaha and a PhD in neuroscience at the University of Minnesota. His research integrates brain imaging, neurocognitive assessments, and computational models to examine co-occurring issues like trauma, depression, and cognitive dysfunction in individuals with substance use disorder. He is part of a team running 2 clinical trials at Penn to investigate psilocybin as a treatment for opioid-use disorder and oversees the neuroimaging and cognitive aspects of the trials. Today, Dr. Regier will be presenting classic psychedelics and mental health, neural mechanisms, and therapeutic promise. If you would like to ask a question during this talk, please enter them into the Q&A function. And without further ado, let's all give him a warm welcome.
All right, thank you guys. Can you hear me okay? And can you see my screen?
Yes, I can see it
Good.
perfectly and hear you clearly as well.
Okay, and not the notes version, right?
No, sure, the presenter mode, yeah.
Perfect. All right, thank you guys. Great introduction, and thank you for inviting me to talk about psychedelics and their potential to treat mental health disorders and addiction. I've been interested in this research for about a decade, since I saw it at the College of Problems of Drug Dependence in 2017, but have only just begun engaging in the actual work. I'll briefly mention the research that we are currently conducting, but we don't have data to share yet, so it'll just be a brief mention. Um, Also, just as a notice, this talk will be an overview of the new wave of research in the 21st century and will be heavily US centric as far as the implications for mental health and addiction, as I am engaged in work with others that will hopefully facilitate FDA approval of these medicines for mental health and addiction treatment. So first, I just want to acknowledge the lab in which I work, the Brain Behavioral Vulnerabilities Lab. It's at the Center of Studies of Addiction at the University of Pennsylvania. This is headed up by Dr. Anna Rose Childress. Um, we receive funding from the National Institute of Health, specifically National Institute of Drug Abuse, to research underlying neurocognitive mechanisms related to opioid use disorder and investigate potential interventions for OUD, including psilocybin-assisted therapy. I also want to acknowledge Logan Riffey, who is now part of our lab and who invited me to talk, and also the staff members who collect the data and keep the studies running. Without these, it takes a village to run these studies. We have a very large team that keeps things running, and without them, we wouldn't be able to do this work. Want to also acknowledge Manesh Gurn, who recently completed his PhD. He and I co-taught a class a few years ago, and he was kind enough to lend me some of his slides. And subsequently, it formed a foundation for this talk early on. So much of what he sent me has completely changed, but his DNA is still in there. He's an excellent communicator, and if he hasn't been mentioned yet, I just want to point out his YouTube channel at the Psychedelic Scientist. And he also has a lot of good work out there in the scientific publication world as well. And then finally, just want to acknowledge all the past and present researchers investigating psychedelics as a potential intervention for mental health and addiction. As of a systematic review in 2024, there's over 120 studies, over 2,000 participants, just a large amount of research being done, a lot of great work being done, looking into many different disorders using different psychedelics. This talk will focus mostly on depression, substance use disorder, which is where my research is, and the psychedelic psilocybin, because that is kind of where we're headed, is that it looks like psilocybin may be the first one that will be FDA approved for depression. All right, so the talk overview. I'm going to first present the data on some of the prevalence of mental health disorders in the US, and the traditional pharmacological treatment of these mental health disorders and some of the challenges associated with that traditional treatment. Then I'll get into the psilocybin effects on mental health disorders and some of the research suggesting and showing promise for reducing symptoms associated with depression and PTSD and substance use disorder. And then I'll do a brief overview of the neuroscience of psychedelics and then discuss the importance of subjective experience and relationship to outcomes. All right, so first, I want to talk about the prevalence of mental health disorders and significance of onset. So, about 1 in 4 individuals in the US have some form of mental health disorder. About a quarter of those are serious mental health disorders. But what I want to discuss around that is that 50% of these mental health disorders are developing by the age of 14, and 75% are developing by the age of 24. So this is a significant period of development in the brain as this is going from age 5 up to age 20. You can see that the brain is becoming more mature. It's losing gray matter as it matures. And so by the end of your early 20s, mid 20s, the brain is fully developed. And these mental health disorders are developing right alongside the development of the brain. So this might suggest that by the time the brain is fully developed, these disorders can become more entrenched and more difficult to change. And here's just another way to look at it. So the orange and the red colors are indicating less maturity or more gray matter. And as you continue on, develop through age 20, becomes more mature and less gray matter. So that means more white matter tracks and more solidification of different functions in the brain. So addiction too is prevalent in the US. About 1 in 5 individuals have some form of addiction. About half of those are alcohol related, half of them are drug use related, and a small percentage of those are have both. So addiction also starts very early. So you can see here, this is showing the blue squares are use, orange is abuse, and blue is dependence. These two are measuring or looking at remission. But what I want you to focus on is this early uptick in use, abuse, and dependence that's occurring before the age of 25. So these are occurring very early. Most people who are in some form of treatment will report that they initiated alcohol or drug use at the age of 17 or younger. So again, these are disorders that are developing early, developing alongside the brain, may make them more difficult to change. So our traditional pharmacological system right now is facing some challenges, and I'm going to highlight a few of those challenges. One is that not everybody who has a mental health disorder is seeking out any treatment, especially pharmacological treatment, for a number of reasons. But the highest percentage of people seeking out treatment are those with depression. So you can see that about 61% of those seek out treatment. But by the end of the first year, so purple is showing seeking treatment, blue is showing 1 year retention. By the end of the first year, only about 20% of those individuals are sticking with treatment. And you can see the numbers are really low for substance use disorder. I'll just point out that there's some reasons for that. About 55% are seeking out any sort of treatment. So that could be 12-step groups, that could be just standard therapy with cognitive behavioral therapy or something like that. But only 25% of those are seeking out pharmacological treatment, which tends to be the best way to treat many of our disorders. And there's reasons for that, of course. We only have medications for certain disorders, like opioid use disorder and alcohol use disorder. Cannabis is becoming more of an issue with more disorders with cannabis and cocaine, and we don't have any medications for those. But the sort of like thing I want to point out here is that even if someone starts on this treatment, by the end of the first year, only about 10 to 20% are sticking with treatment. So what are some of the reasons for that? So this is just an example for first-line treatments for depression and subsequent responses in the first year. And pulling from a couple different studies to put this together. But if we imagine that 10 people have depression and only 60% of those seek out treatment, um, only about three of those are going to be a responder for those first line treatments, meaning that they have a significant reduction in symptoms. And so you'll have three non-responders who might go back to square one. They might start a new medication. They might not. They might not go back to treatment. But then of those three, only one or one and a half actually remit from the disorder. So they don't meet any criteria for the disorder. And the rest either relapse or they quit, or other things could happen. So even those who go into remission can still face relapse. They can build tolerance to the medication. They stop taking the medication because they feel better or they have negative side effects, so on and so forth. So this people with mental health disorders who are seeking out pharmacological treatment tend to get in this cycle of treatment and non-treatment, trying new things, working for a while, stopping, failing, and it's a pretty difficult cycle to get into. Um, so why would psychedelics be any better? So the promise for psychedelics for mental health disorder suggests that it could be, a game changer in the way that we treat mental health and addiction. So I'm going to talk about a couple different depression studies with different designs. This is a crossover design where they had 24 individuals that were randomized to either a delayed treatment or immediate treatment. This baseline is at week 4, so just keep that in mind. So those in the immediate treatment, they received a dose of psilocybin, and by the first week after dosing, they saw a significant reduction in depression scores. They're using the HAM-D here. And that sustained up to 4 weeks. So there's a significant reduction that lasted for quite a while. And that was significantly lower than those in the delayed treatment. And so those in the delayed treatment, after week 8, they also received the medication. So everybody received psilocybin in this study. And they pooled those together, and they showed that this antidepressant response was significant at week 1, so almost immediately, and then persisted up to 4 weeks. And 71% of the participants continued to show a clinically significant response at that week 4 visit. Okay, so this is another type of design, an active control design. And I'm just bringing these up because there are, if you're following the research, you know that there's some issues with blinding and making sure that people aren't aware that they're getting the medication and so on and so forth. So this is one way to control for that, is to have an active control, having a high dose of psilocybin at 25 milligrams, an active dose at 10 milligrams. So this should be a dose that elicits some form of subjective experience. So you feel like you at least have gotten psilocybin, but it should not produce the same therapeutic effects. And they also had a third group of an active placebo. So everybody gets psilocybin, but just different doses. And this was a fairly large trial too, with around 75 to 80 people in each group. So in this study, they found that at week 3, which was their primary endpoint, there was a significant reduction in depression scores in the 25 milligram group, so the highest dose compared to baseline, but not to the 10 milligram group. Um, and the 10 mil and but the 10 milligram group did not have a significant reduction compared to baseline. So this is a nice control showing that even with an active control, higher dose, 25 milligrams, still is producing a significant effect that is sustained for several weeks. So for depression, at least, the promise for the psychedelic promise is that these medicines, this intervention, psychedelic assisted therapy with a psychedelic can have rapid reductions in symptoms and a sustained effect. And so this is much different than our traditional model with traditional psychotropics like SSRIs and SNRIs, and um, where traditional medications for depression typically take weeks to kick in, whereas psychedelics it's 1 to 3 days. We're seeing effects, the following week. The sustained remission seems to be higher, and the neuroplastic effects seem to be greater. So psychotropics have, some neuroplastic effects, but they're much more gradual, much more subtle. And that seems to be the case with most of these psychotropics. It's a more subtle effect. You don't really even notice that you are getting better sometimes. Sometimes people will come up to you and say, "Oh, you seem to be better." And um, so these are more subtle, happening more at the subconscious level compared to psychedelics. So it is a very different type of model. And it also means that people can come in and get, 1 or 2 doses, see immediate change, which is very helpful for your mental state, and maybe just get boosters in the future. So, 6 months down the road, maybe a year down the road, you get another dose of psilocybin or MDMA or LSD or whatever the case will be in the future. So I just want to also acknowledge the other disorders that are being investigated. So PTSD is the other big one, where they are using MDMA as the primary psychedelic, which is primarily used because it's a less intense subjective experience. So people can get into some deep therapeutic conversations and kind of dig into that traumatic past without all of the fear and all of the baggage around that, and see some really positive change. So these studies are showing that MDMA is demonstrating significant reductions in PTSD symptoms in phase 3 trials. You can see a significant reduction here after session 3. And at an 18-week follow-up. So again, these are, three doses that are lasting, up to 18 weeks. 67% no longer met criteria for PTSD at that time point. So really promising results. The data for substance use disorders are just emerging. So the first one that was done that showed a promising signal was in smoking. So in this study, they were looking at urinary cotinine, which is just a measure of nicotine in the urine, and they showed that 12 out of the 15 people who enrolled in the study were completely abstinent at the 6-month follow-up visit, which is much higher than any traditional type of nicotine replacement therapy or any type of medication. And 3 of them reduced use but didn't quit. So this was done by Matthew Johnson and his group at Johns Hopkins. And so they did a follow-up and they found that even after 16 months, 9 of these individuals were still completely abstinent. And that was from just 1 or 2 doses of psilocybin. And so the largest trial done so far, completed so far in addiction is alcohol use disorder. And so they saw that with 2 doses of psilocybin, there was a significant reduction in heavy drinking days and daily alcohol consumption. And that was over 36 weeks. So again, 2 doses, long-lasting effects, significant rapid reductions, long-lasting effects. And then we had a recent cocaine trial just come out this year showing that psilocybin may help with cocaine. And this is big because we don't have any medications for cocaine. So this could be the first medication that could actually help people pharmacologically with cocaine use disorder. And they saw that people who were in the psilocybin active psilocybin group had a higher percentage of cocaine abstinence days and reduced risk of cocaine lapse. And so the s- we're like right now we are looking at psilocybin as a treatment for opioid use disorder. We're one of the groups that is looking at this. There's about 10 trials that are ongoing right now. So we should have results in the next few years. Most of these studies are focusing on using psilocybin-assisted therapy as an adjunct treatment for medications for opioid use disorder. And some of that is just because it's dangerous out there taking opioids. There's a lot of contaminants. There's a lot of high potency opioids. So taking people off of medication for opioid use disorder is just too risky. So we're using it as an adjunct to see if this helps with treatment outcomes like drug use, medication adherence, and even mood symptoms like well-being, depression, and anxiety symptoms. But we're also looking at the effects of psilocybin on brain mechanisms of motivation and decision making. So we follow a traditional uh, design where we have preparation, 2 preparation sessions, followed by a dosing day of 25 milligrams versus 1 milligram. And so in the end, we hope we're going for a 2-to-1 ratio where we'll have 24 individuals who get the high dose and 12 individuals who get the low dose. Um, and so, sorry, just taking a look, make sure there's nothing there. Um, and after dosing, they get integration. Um, and then we look at 8 weeks of follow-up. But we also have these brain and behavioral measures that we're looking pre and post psilocybin. So we're looking at things like cognitive flexibility, adaptive decision making, inhibition, and other kind of cognitive realms. So we're hoping that we can get 36 individuals enrolled in this study and have data to show in the next couple years. All right, so I want to do a quick overview of the neuroscience of psychedelics. First, starting with the neuropsychopharmacology of classic psychedelics. So the the primary psychedelic I'm want to talk about is psilocybin, just because it's so prevalent right now. And the primary metabolite or the active ingredient in psilocybin is psilocin. And this is a receptor agonist at the 5-HT2A receptor. That's a serotonin receptor. It has action on a bunch of other serotonin subtypes as well, including the 5-HT1A receptor. And I'm highlighting these two because they are, 5-HT2A is an excitatory receptor, whereas 5-HT1A is inhibitory. So classic psychedelics are acting on the 5-HT2A receptor, whereas traditional psychotropics like antidepressants are acting more so on the 5-HT1A. And I'll discuss that a little bit more in the next slide. So we have good evidence that the 5-HT2A receptor is responsible for psychedelic effects because 5-HT2A antagonists block neural and subjective effects. And we have a strong relationship between the occupancy of these 5-HT2A receptors. So more receptors that are occupied is associated with an increased subjective intensity rating. So a really strong, robust curve there. Okay, so the want to talk a little bit about the serotonin effects because we're doing some comparing and contrasting between traditional treatment and this new psychedelic treatment. So 5-HT1A receptors are found primarily in limbic and stress circuitry, and this is where antidepressants are primarily working. And this so because they're occurring in more subcortical areas, this is more subtle. It's more at the subconscious level, but there tends to be over time a gradual reduction in limbic responsivity, stress, and anxiety with increased resilience and patience. And so the authors of this paper, which I encourage you to check out, it's by Robin Carr Harris and David Nutt, called The Tale of Two Receptors. They refer to this type of this type of response as passive coping because it's sort of happening, like I said, below the subconscious level. It might even be occurring without you really noticing what's happening. Whereas with psychedelics, the effects are very noticeable. And these are the 5-HT2A receptors are primarily they're found all over the brain, but primarily the focus right now has been on cortical and regulatory areas, and this has the effect of reducing rigid thinking, and increasing plasticity, learning, adaptability. Uh, and these are effects that you feel and you sort of have, a sense that you can change it, that you can learn or unlearn something, that you can adapt. And so these authors call this active coping. So again, it's just a different model of treatment. So how does psilocybin affect brain networks? How does this all work in the brain? So studies are suggesting that networks become less integrated with themselves and more integrated between each other. So what does that mean? In a sort of non psilocybin state or a placebo state, typically parts of the brain are talking more within each other. So they're talking to themselves more so rather than to each other. Each one of these colors represents different networks in the brain, and the different circles represent different regions. And so you can see that, purple's talking to purple, blue's mainly talking to blue, and there's some crosstalk, but not a lot, and especially not in comparison to psilocybin, where there's less, within network communication, and there's more between network connectivity that's occurring. And so recently, Manesh Gurn put out a paper examining a bunch. This was a mega analysis using a lot of data across the globe, um, and showed really nicely this within network integration decrease. So all these blue areas are showing that there's decrease within network integration or less connectivity within the brain networks. Whereas between network integration, you can see this, the red areas are representing increased functional connectivity between different areas. Um, and there are specific areas that are, kind of popping up as the most important ones that are having more connectivity. I'm not going to get into that in this particular talk, but this paper outlines some of those different areas. Um, and so this is all the acute changes. This is, after someone has taken a psychedelic um, in some of these trials. This is the type of brain changes you see acutely. But there are long-term changes as well. So studies are suggesting that psilocybin dosing is associated with decreased modularity. This is, kind of another way to talk about like this within and between network integration. So modularity is just referring to how kind of insulated a region, a brain network is, how much um, the authors describe it as computing the extent to which brain functional connectivity can be divided into distinct networks or modules of the brain that are either more strongly connected within a network than they are to other regions outside the network. So you see this decrease in modularity post-treatment, and in some studies, up to a month later, you see decreased modularity in the brain. And that this decreased modularity is associated with better clinical outcomes. So here, this is showing that decreased modularity is associated with decreased depression symptoms. Okay, and then another recent paper from the Carhart-Harris group, they were using EEG during the session. So they're getting brain signals during the session in a more natural way. So they're not necessarily having to be, they're not in an MRI, and they can be laying down on a couch with this EEG um, device collecting brain signals. And so they're using this measure called LZC, or Lempel-Ziv complexity. And this is just indexing statistical irregularity or incompressibility. So essentially, like, how complicated is this signal and how predictable is this signal? And if it's very predictable, then you can compress it more. And if it's more complicated, less predictable, you're unable to compress it. So this is, a model, a prediction model that they're using. And so during the dosing session, they see an increase in this LZC signal, which they call it entropy, we can just call it entropy. So an increase in entropy during the dosing session that you don't see in the 1 milligram group. And this study was all done in healthy controls who have never received psychedelic before. So this is first time psychedelic dose for these individuals, and this is what's occurring in the brain in these individuals. Also, a really great paper. I encourage you to check this out by, again, out of the Carhart-Harris group. So they found that this entropy signal, so increased entropy, was associated with psychological insight, or more, kind of these aha moments, or these moments of trying to figure out, oh, what is it I really need to do in my life to make things a little bit better? So they saw that increased brain entropy was associated with better insight a day after dosing. And this increased entropy was also associated with increased well-being. So general sense of just, having a better life, a better situation 1 month later. So that's an encouraging signal. However, I thought what was interesting is that the strongest model was the entropy signal to insight to well-being. So insight is sort of mediating the signal. And when you do this, when you perform this model, the connection between entropy and well-being is no longer significant. So it's suggesting that, insight is necessary. These insight moments, either during the session or after the session, during integration, are necessary to long-term change. Now, again, this is in healthy control, so I don't think this is the full story for people with disorders, but we'll get into that in a little bit. Okay, so next I want to talk about the critical period reopening study that was done a couple years ago. So there's a lot going on here, so just bear with me, be patient a little bit. So a critical period uh, refers to a period in early development when a part of the brain is highly plastic and sensitive to inputs. Think about, our acquisition of language early on. There's a specific period where we can acquire language much more easily. And after that period, it's much more difficult to learn a different language. Think about trying to learn a different language in high school versus your native language growing up. And so rodents have a critical period called the social learning critical period, and this can be assessed by condition place preference. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with condition place preference, for this particular study, they use a box with two different sides, and both of these sides have different contexts. So they're representing these by a green color and a purple color, but in reality, they have some sort of unique context. Maybe the floor has different tactile sense, or there's different smell in there, or the rodents are able to tell which side is which is the important part, I guess. Um, so then they pair one side with social conditioning with other rodents, and they pair the other side with isolate conditioning, so by themselves, and they do this for 24 hours each. And then they look at which side does the rodent prefer. And during their critical period, which is looks to be from age 21 to 49, the rodents highly prefer this social side. And so that starts to decrease after age 49. And by the time they're fully formed adults, which is after age 90 days for rodents, they don't really have a preference for either side. So these are different cohorts of animals each time. So it's not like one animal is, taking this test throughout its life. These are naive rodents each time they test this period. And this is just showing the social preference score. So scores above indicate that they have more of a preference for the social side. So what they showed is that even after having a fully formed brain, fully formed, adult, being a fully formed adult, they could give psychedelic, in this case MDMA, and reopen that, so to speak, reopen that critical period and show that the rats then again had a social preference score that was higher than normal. And they did this for a bunch of other psychedelics as well, psilocybin, LSD, even ketamine and ibogaine. And what they suggest is that this critical period, this critical reopening period, is lasts for, is correlated with the duration of the subjective effects. So for instance, ketamine only, it's a couple hours at most. So the critical reopening period is only 48 hours, whereas psilocybin, a dosing session is around 4 to 6 hours. And the critical reopening period is around 2 weeks, so on and so forth. So the longer the subjective experience seems to correlate more so with a period of time after the dosing where more learning and more change could occur, and where some of these things that were more embedded could be remediated. So, as I mentioned at the very beginning, this time of onset is really important, we think, because as the brain is developing alongside these mental health disorders, it may mean that it's more embedded and that we've missed an opportunity to change that early on. If we didn't intervene early on, maybe it makes it more difficult to change later. But this is suggesting that psychedelics may be able to reopen that period and create more change. So we can think of these medicines as neuroplastogens that are promoting expression of genes related to neuroplasticity, like immediate early genes or brain-derived neurotropic factor. And these are, doing things like increasing long-term potentiation, which is important for new learning, and relearning or forgetting, which is just, another type of learning. It can catalyze or promote more synaptogenesis and dendritic growth, allowing for more connections to occur where they weren't before. It may increase neurogenesis, and these results are primarily from animals at this point. They suggest that There's moderate, strong evidence of neuroplasticity in animals, but the results from humans are still inconclusive. So that's, kind of a big caveat here is that it appears this is the case from the animal studies, but we'll have to see how well this translates into human studies once we have more data. But it appears very promising. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is the subjective experience and whether this is important for promoting better clinical outcomes. Excuse me, I just had to take a drink. So we know that psilocybin induces an altered state of consciousness, which correlates with different subjective experiences. In the lab, we're measuring a few of those subjective experiences. So it's not, it's not measuring. We're not capturing every single subjective experience, and there might be some that are missed. Um, but some of the ones that have been focused on so far have been this mystical experiences, which is kind of this profound spiritual experience, a real increase in meaning and importance. Psychological insight, which we discussed already, can be defined as the ability to clearly see a problem or these aha or eureka moments. Um, Excuse me, in alcoholism, sometimes they're referred to as moments of clarity. And then in the other one is psychological flexibility, which can be defined as this willingness to accept the problem and change. Um, so, do these matter to outcomes? So, mystical experiences are induced by psilocybin. And what some studies have found is that those who are responders, so we talked about responders before, it means a significant reduction in symptoms brought on by the pharmacological treatment. So responders had higher amounts of mystical experiences, like experience of unity, blissful states, insightfulness, so on and so forth, than the non-responders. But the responders and the non-responders both had the same level of, like trippy imagery and that kind of like visual experience of the psychedelic. That was the same, but mystical experiences was higher in the responders. And since that study, other studies have found relationship with mystical experience with outcomes as well. So in this study, they found that higher mystical experience score was associated with lower craving for smoking. In this study, they found lower depression scores and lower anxiety scores with higher mystical experience scores. So psychological insight, there seems to be a dose response increase of psychological insight. So you can see here psilocybin and LSD. Psilocybin's in blue, LSD's in green, and then this insightfulness score is on the y-axis. And as you increase the dose, you tend to see more higher scores on this insightfulness score or this insightfulness questionnaire. And this too seems to be associated with better clinical outcomes. So there's a positive relationship insight with this well-being score, which again, well-being is just it's just a measure of how good you feel about your life, your situation. It captures some mood and things like that. But there was the highest correlation with those who had low well-being to begin with. So at baseline, there were some individuals with lower well-being, and they had a greater increase in well-being scores by the end of the study. So again, that kind of points to this remediation, like people with, either disorder or below average, whatever mood symptoms, whatever, can be remediated by the psychedelic, maybe more so than if you were looking at this in healthy controls. And then psychological flexibility. Um, these studies are looking at a decrease in cognitive inflexibility. So these graphs get a little screwy. But you can think of it as like fewer flexibility errors. So psychedelics are associated with fewer flexibility errors and more cognitive flexibility is associated with better outcomes. So this is showing, decreased cognitive inflexibility associated with decreased depression symptoms. So it seems like psychedelics increase these subjective experiences, mystical experiences, psychological insight, and flexibility, and that all of these subjective experiences are associated with better clinical outcomes. However, there was at least one study looking at psychological flexibility as a mediator. So when they looked at mystical effects and insight independently, both of these predicted clinical outcomes. So you can see that mystical effects was associated with better clinical outcomes, and when you added psychological insight, it was an even better model, better predicted clinical outcomes. But when they put psychological flexibility in the model as a mediator, uh, the these independent associations were no longer significant, and it was mediated completely through psychological flexibility. And so maybe the relationship looks more like this, where you can have a mystical experience, you can have all of this insight during the session and after, and kind of understand what it is that I need to do to have a better life. But without this psychological flexibility, the willingness to change, and I think of this as more of empowerment. It seems to be, uh, uh, empowering people to make that change, to have that adaptability and be willing to kind of accept where they're at and do the work to make change. Okay. So in summary, I talked about how mental health and addiction, they start early while the brain is still developing, which may mean it's more entrenched and more difficult to change as a result. And that traditional pharmacological treatments, for some people, can lead to a difficult cycle of treatment and non-treatment. That's not everybody. So one thing is that, the way that they're using this in depression, I think makes sense, is that you have treatment-resistant depression, you've tried other things, and if it doesn't work, you can, try psychedelics and see if that helps. Um, it seems like psychedelics are a promising treatment for mental health disorders and addiction. There's a lot of promising research coming out. Of course, we need more data and more people in these trials and better blinding to get FDA approval, but I think we're on that road. And it's showing rapid reduction in symptoms and a sustained effect after one or two doses. And that's really encouraging because it reduces the burden on people to have to take these medications, to have to continue dealing with this cycle, and it, reduces burden, and that helps everybody. We have enough to worry about these days as it is. And so in the brain, classic psychedelics, they act on 5-HT2A receptors, which is associated with the subjective psychedelic effects. And other brain effects include acute decreases in within network connectivity, but increases in between network connectivity, and sort of this increase in brain state exploration. I guess I didn't really talk about that. I sort of skipped over that. But that entropy signal is sort of suggesting that there are multiple brain states being explored during the dosing session, and that could correlate with these subjective insight effects. So that, brain state exploration seems to be an important piece of the puzzle as well. Um, and so longer term changes may include a decrease in brain-wide modularity, windows of opportunity for new learning, and increases in neuroplasticity to promote these better long-term outcomes. And could explain, the sustained effect, because if you take advantage of this neuroplastic window and make changes during that period, it's going to solidify those more, and it's going to create, better long-term change. And possibly, there's just one study that found this, but psychological flexibility may mediate the relationships between insight, mystical experiences, and better treatment outcomes. But conceptually, to me, that sort of makes sense. So that's all I have. Thank you for listening, and thank you again for the invitation. I'd be happy to take questions.